Time to take a look at Rommel's perspective on the weeks following the D-Day invasion. He personally was absent during the initial landings since he celebrated his wife's birthday in Germany. Yet we have two of his situation reports, one from 11th June 1944, so 5 days after the landings, and one from 15th July 1944. By the way, for a properly sourced German perspective on the D-Day landings based on the situations report of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht and the war diary of the 7th German Army, check out this video. Let us look at the first report from 11th June 1944. Here you can see the front lines based on the maps of the 12th Army Group, which consists of the 1st US Army, which is on the western side, and the 2nd British Army on the eastern side of the map. At first, Rommel identifies the intention of the Allies. First, to gain a deep beachhead between the rivers Orne and Vire as a base for a later attack with strong forces into the interior of France, probably in the direction of Paris. Second, to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula and take Cherbourg as quickly as possible in order to have a large, effective harbor. It also seems possible, however, as things develop, that the enemy will forgo the seizure of the Cotentin Peninsula if the fighting there becomes too hard, and make an early thrust into the interior of France, using all means at his disposal. He continues, as a result of the stubborn fighting by the troops engaged in the coastal defense sections and the immediate hasty counterattacks by the larger available reserves, the progress of the enemy operations has been considerably slower than the enemy had hoped, despite the use of the strongest combat equipment. It is important to note here that the German High Command and Hitler were very critical about the performance of the Generals Rundstedt, Rommel and the German soldiers in general. This and other factors led to the replacement of General Rundstedt in early July. His replacement, General Kluge, also scolded Rommel when he arrived, yet Kluge soon changed his opinion after his first visit to the front, that was interrupted several times by Allied air attacks, in which he repeatedly had to seek cover in roadside ditches. Rommel's assessment seems to be mostly on spot, according to the historian C.J. Dick. By 13th June, so 2 days after the report, a continuous shallow bridgehead had been established. However, progress had fallen short of Allied hopes. On the left, the British had failed to take Caen, a vital road center with crossings over the River Orne to the south, that had been unrealistically designated as a D-Day objective. Their foothold over the river to the east was very restricted. In the west, the Americans were still more than 20 kilometers or 12 miles from Cherbourg and somewhat less distant from the key junction of 7 roads at St. Cloud, significantly short of the expected rate of advance. Yet let's go back to Rommel's assessment. He adds that the Allies protected by air power continuously improved their numbers, whereas the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine are basically absent during the day. As such, the Allied forces grew faster than the German reserves. About air power, he particularly notes the following aspect. Due to the extremely strong superiority of the enemy in the air, it has not been possible to bring up the 1st SS Panzer Corps, the Werferbrigade 7 and the 3rd Flak Corps. Furthermore, to bring 2nd Fallschirmjäger Corps Meindl quickly into the area between Orne and Vire. And to counterattack against the landed enemy is also not possible. Werferbrigade, Flak Corps and Meindl Corps are still on the march. 1st SS Panzer Corps is pressed into defense under hard fighting and is attacked on its west wing by superior tank units. He continues that the objective of the army group is to create a continuous front line between the rivers Orne and Vire, adding that currently it is not possible to relieve any of the German troops that are cut off near the coastline. Furthermore, the plan is to exchange the panzer divisions with infantry divisions in order to create mobile reserves. For the upcoming days, it is intended to destroy the enemy forces in the area Carentan-Montebourg. This could remove the threat towards Cherbourg. Only after this objective has been achieved does an attack against the enemy between the river Orne and Vire seem viable. Yet then Rommel outlines 4 factors that restrict German operations in the Normandy region. Our own operations in Normandy, however, are extraordinarily difficult and in some cases even impractical by the following. A. The exceptionally strong and part overwhelming superiority of the enemy air force. As I, an officer of my staff, have repeatedly seen for ourselves, and as the troop commanders, especially Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, which was the commander of the 1st Panzer Corps, report, the enemy completely controls the airspace over the battle area up to 100 km behind the front. and by day with a strong fighter bomber and bomber formations almost prevents all traffic on roads, paths, and in open terrain. Even the movement of smaller units on the battlefield, artillery emplacements, deployment of tanks and the like are immediately bombed from the air to devastating effect. A bit of context here, Josef Sepp Dietrich, before being commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, was commander of the 1st SS Panzerdivision Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Before the war he served as Hitler's chauffeur and later as commander of his personal bodyguard. As such he was well known to Hitler. Back to Rommel's list, besides air power he notes another major material advantage of the Allies. B. The effect of heavy naval artillery. Up to 640 guns were used. The effect is so strong that operation in the space dominated by this rapid-fire artillery is impossible with either infantry or panzer units. Despite this heavy bombardment, the garrisons on the coast and the counter-attacking troops in the Monteborg area held their positions with extreme tenacity. We are aware that Rommel likely applied the term heavy here according to Army, not Navy standards, since 150mm is heavy artillery for the German Army, whereas for the Navy it was not. For the number of guns, the number seems to be valid as well. Dracheniffel did some data crunching, and he noted for D-Day the number of 4-inch or larger guns without dedicated AA weapons is at over 900, albeit some wouldn't be available at the same time. Secondary batteries split either side of the battleships and cruisers, for example. Of course, on D-Day there was likely a higher concentration of warships as well. The next factor that Rommel mentions is the material of the American and British forces, which he considered far superior to our divisions, unseren Divisionen weit überlegen. He again refers to Sepp Dietrich in this part. As Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich has reported to me, the enemy panzer units are conducting the battle already at 3,500 meters with the greatest expenditure of ammunition and excellently supported by the enemy air force. This was also the case at El Alamein. Furthermore, the strong artillery superiority and the particularly large ammunition reserves already become apparent. The final factor at first seems like it was not an issue and a wrong assessment by Rommel, yet considering the German intelligence and Allied deception activity, this was actually a valid point. D. Parachute and air landing troops are employed in such mass and are so maneuverable that the engaged force finds it difficult to resist them. Once enemy airborne units have parachuted into terrain unoccupied by us, they immediately set up for defense and are difficult to defeat by infantry attacks with artillery support. Further sorties, especially in areas not occupied by us, are to be expected. Since the enemy with his air force, as has been shown in the last few days, can paralyze our mobile formations for days, but is himself operating with fast formations and airborne troops, our own situation becomes extremely difficult. So why was this point valid? Well, the Allies had launched a military deception operation called Operation Quicksilver. One key element of that operation was the fictitious 1st United States Army Group. And at least at one point the order of battle of this army group included 3 airborne divisions. So this likely is based on German intelligence reports about these fictitious formations. The report ends with the following 2 sentences. The troops of all parts of the Wehrmacht are fighting with the greatest tenacity and the utmost commitment, in spite of tremendous expenditure of material by the enemy. I asked to personally report to the Führer on this. The next major report from Rommel I have access to is from 15th July 1944, so more than a month later. As you can see, the frontline had changed quite extensively. I will give a brief overview on the most important events that happened in that period. 12th June, US forces managed to take Carentan. On the 15th June, the British tried to take Villers-Bocage, yet they were stopped by a handful of Tigers. On the 17th of June, Hitler comes to France near Soissons, which is about 100 km northeast of Paris. Here he meets with the generals Rommel and Rundstedt. He insists that there can't be a retreat and agrees to continue the preparations for a panzer attack. On the next day, US forces reach the western coastline of the Cotentin Peninsula. Thus Cherbourg is cut off from the German lines. On the 25th of June, the British launch a major attack on Caen. 2 days later, Cherbourg falls. Additionally, in this time frame, at least 1 German corps commander was killed by fighter bombers, Another general very likely committed suicide after he was relieved of command. 29th June to 1st of July, Rommel and Rundstedt meet again with Hitler, this time in Bavaria. A situation report by 4 generals, namely Rommel, Rundstedt, Hauser and Geyer, is submitted. This leads to the relief of Rundstedt and Geyer a few days later. The former is replaced with General Kluge. On 8th of July, another major attack against Caen is launched. 2 days later, the parts north of the river are taken. On the 11th July, US forces start the bombardment at the line Saint-Lô-Lessay. Here you can see the situation on the 15th July 1944 based on Allied maps of the time. So let us look at Rommel's report. The situation on the Normandy front is becoming more difficult by the day and is approaching a severe crisis. With the severity of the fighting, the exceptionally heavy use of material by the enemy, especially artillery and tanks, and the effect of the enemy's air force dominating the battle space without restriction. Our own losses are so high that the fighting strength of the divisions is dropping very rapidly. He then outlines about losses and replacements since the start of the invasion. About 97,000 men, including 2,360 officers, were lost, so about 2,000 to 500 per day. Yet only 10,000 replacements had been made available, of which only 6,000 have arrived so far. He also notes that with the material it is the same and gives an example for the Panzer. About 225 were lost, while only 17 were replaced. Rommel continues, the newly assigned infantry divisions are unaccustomed to combat, and with the low level of artillery, armor-piercing weapons and close combat anti-tank ordnance, are unable to successfully repel large-scale enemy attacks for any length of time after several hours of barrage and heavy bombardment. As the fighting has shown, even the bravest troops are broken piece by piece to the enemy's use of material, and lose weapons and terrain. He then outlines the problem of the destroyed infrastructure, its effect on the combat capabilities, and notes the situation will worsen. The supply conditions are so difficult due to the destruction of the railroad network, the strong endangerment of the roads and paths up to 100 kilometers behind the front by the enemy air force that only the bare necessities can be brought in. And above all, artillery and large ammunition must be used extremely sparingly everywhere. These conditions are not likely to improve, since the transport capacity is sinking more and more into the enemy action, and the enemy air activity is expected to become even more effective when the numerous airfields in the beachhead come into operation. Of course, the Allies ran into some supply problems as well. Yet let's put them in proper context. The US supply in the first week after D-Day was only 50% of the planned amount. Then from 19th to 22nd of June there was a storm that destroyed or almost destroyed, depending on who you ask, the US Mulberry Harbor at Ohama Beach. Still, in the final week of June, US supply reached 80% of the planned amount. Of course, how much did the Germans get? Well, sadly I don't have a percentage here, yet I got a metric ton per day for the US forces and the German forces, namely 15 to 20,000 tons versus 1,300 tons. Keep in mind that was for all German forces, whereas the other values does not include the British and Canadian forces. Back to Rommel, he continues that the balance of forces will shift more and more to the Allies, since the Germans can't bring any more new forces without weakening other fronts, like the southern coast in France or the 15th Army near Pas-de-Calais. Furthermore, the Allies continue to receive more material as well, since their supply lines are not threatened by the Luftwaffe nor the Kriegsmarine. The question is if this is correct or not. Well, we have some data for 10 days later, namely the 25th of July. C.G. Dick notes, the seriousness of German maladeployment is well illustrated by the fact that in Normandy, the only active front in the west, the Allies enjoyed a 3.8 to 1 superiority in manpower, 4.7 to 1 in armor, and 3 to 1 in artillery. The last figure is seriously misleading, however, as German ammunition supply was woefully inadequate. American guns, for instance, were firing 4 times as many shells per day. Rommel concludes with the following prediction. Under these circumstances, it must be expected that in the foreseeable future, the enemy will succeed in breaking through our thin front, especially that of the 7th Army, and push into the vastness of the French area. I would like to refer to the attached reports from the 7th Army and the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Corps. apart from local reserves of the Panzergruppe West, which are initially tied down by the fighting on the Panzergroup front and can march only at night in the face of enemy air superiority. There are no mobile reserves available to repel such a breakthrough at the 7th Army. The use of our own air force, as before, is of very little consequence. 3 days later, the British and Canadian forces started Operation Goodwood, although it failed. A classic set-piece battle gone wrong. Goodwood was a huge operation carried out by Montgomery's entire 21st Army Group. Despite heavy bombing that once again smashed the German front, killing thousands and driving equal numbers stiff and mad, Montgomery's attack got stuck in the front of the German positions on a slight rise known as Bourbon Ridge. Goodwood, Eisenhower raged, had cost 7,000 tons of bombs in order to gain a total of 7 miles and once again had failed to break through. Yet a few days later, on the 25th of July, the US forces started Operation Cobra. Although the first day saw limited progress, soon the US forces broke through the German lines. Yet it's important to mention here that due to the continuous British and Canadian attacks around Caen, the Germans have focused large parts of the armored formations there. As such, the Americans faced less opposition. Yet back to Rommel. He ends the report with the following sentences. The troops are fighting heroically everywhere. However, the unequal struggle is coming to an end. It is necessary, in my opinion, to draw the conclusions from this situation. I feel obliged, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army Group, to state this clearly. Now keep in mind here that Rommel had met Hitler at least 2 times since the first report was written that had a similar ending. 2 days later, on the 17th of July, Rommel's car was attacked by fighter bombers. His driver was killed and he was gravely wounded. To summarize, Rommel's assessment of the situation in Normandy seems to be spot on for the most part. The most serious deviation seems to be related to the Allied deception campaign that created a fictitious army group, which likely led Rommel to believe that another paratroop attack was a possibility. Well, thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Special thanks to Drache Niffel for the numbers on D-Day, Naval Artillery. Big thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. As always, sources are listed in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.